In the previous two episodes, we applied biblical principles concerning the nature of man, the nature of government, and the nature of God to the concentration of power and discovered how all three directs us towards a limited and decentralized form of government. We continue this theme in this episode by examining how the three God-ordained governments, family, church, and state, relate to decentralization. In a previous episode, we discussed why they are considered ordained. In this one, we're going to see how they apply to the idea of decentralization. To begin, the three ordained governments were created for a particular purpose and were delegated specific and distinct responsibilities and authority to fulfill their purpose. For example, family government was delegated the authority to raise, educate, and care for their children. Church government was delegated the authority to perform the sacraments, to do charity, to preach the gospel, to evangelize and make disciples. Civil government was granted the role of being God's servant and delegated the authority to restrain evil, to punish evil, to exercise God's wrath, and to condone good. This comes from Romans 12 and 13. Thus, it is apparent that the Bible promotes and is consistent with the idea or principle of separation of church and state. But it is even more than that. It is separation of church and state and family. And when one considers a proper understanding of rights and authority, this separation of certain areas of life from civil government grows to include business and labor, clubs, universities, communities, and more. Speaking of communities, it takes only common sense to realize the foolishness and absurdity of having a system where people from a far-off land with a different culture dictate how you and members of your community live and conduct themselves. Senators from North Carolina, Florida, and Minnesota, for example, have no business dictating particular laws to govern a small town in Wyoming. The people of that town, of that community, have the right to govern themselves. There are over 19,000 cities in the United States. The idea that the best system of government is to have one city rule over all others, to have one city rule over the lives of 330 million people, not only makes zero sense, but is contrary to God's design. Concentrating increasing amounts of power into fewer hands at the expense of families, churches, and communities is a recipe for oppression and civil unrest. God created and delegated authority to these different areas of life, these different spheres, so to speak, to perform certain roles, and therefore have distinct responsibilities. No sphere should encroach upon others. And each sphere should stringently guard its authority and responsibilities from encroachment by civil government. Totalitarian government occurs when all spheres become subject to the state. Maintaining sphere sovereignty not only is consistent with biblical principles, but is an effective method to keep the state limited and decentralized. A point of clarification. Although separation of church and state is consistent with biblical principles, what is not consistent is separation of God and state. God, Scripture, must never be severed from any sphere. Separating God from the state is removing the very foundation that grants us liberty.